Hello, folks. How we doing? So good to see some new faces in chat. Oh my, look at that caption box. Wow, those are super legible, aren't they? Give me a second to just fix those up to make sure those folks who find it difficult to hear are able to still access this lecture. But yeah, I suppose now's a good time to get into a spiel. Hi, everyone. If you're coming into this lecture for the first time, welcome to Professor Chang's Tabletop Workshop. This is basically my little area where I talk about all things tabletop. I offer my advice as a professional GM and an actual play GM for almost 2 years now at this point, over a year and a half. And I try to just sort of share all the little tips and tricks I've picked up in my career about GMing. So folks can hopefully glean something from my experience, learn from my mishaps, and let's just chill out and have a good time here and talk about tabletop stuff. Because who doesn't want to talk about tabletop stuff? That's why you're here. The topic for today's lecture is facilitating emotions. It is a topic I'm very passionate about and very excited to dig into, actually. I feel really hyped off of the tale of Big Bad Con 2021's last night, actually, as of the recording of this stream. Panel that I was honored and privileged enough to be a panelist on, called The Heart of Games, right? But before we dig into the lecture, a couple of announcements to just get out of the way. So as of the recording of this live stream, episode 6 of The Hounds of Mercy, which is the all-trans, all-BIMPOC mini-series that I GM for on Transplanar RPG's channel, is this coming Tuesday, October 26th at 7 p.m. U.S. Central Time. So make sure to tune in if you're free for that. It's gonna be a wild ride. Hounds of Mercy, I think, is truly a study of how I do emotional GMing, right? So if you want to see some of these concepts put into action, in a livable, real way, tune into Hounds of Mercy this coming Tuesday. And of course, our main campaign next episode is this coming Saturday, October 30th, at 3 p.m. U.S. Central Time, the Halloween's Eve, right? Arc 4 Episode 7 is going to be then, and Arc 4 has just been an emotional roller coaster this entire arc. So I'm really excited to discuss those things in this lecture moving forward. So let's dive right into the lecture. I always like to start things off with an overview of how this lecture is going to go, so you, as an audience member, will know what to expect. I'm going to start with a quick shout out of Big Bad Con, which is the inspiration for today's topic, and then a quick introduction about facilitating emotions in general. What does it mean? Why should you care? Why does it matter? What's bleed, etc. And then we're going to get into how I center emotions as a GM and as a player at my tables, and then we're going to discuss how I facilitate emotions and bleed specifically, and my thoughts about bleed, right? And like the role they play currently in TTRPG communities. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I facilitate emotions in my game design using my upcoming game, the Godkiller RPG, as a lens through which I talk y'all through that. So let's get started. The first thing, of course, is going to be a shout out for Big Bad Con. So Big Bad Con 2021, the heart of games, designing, embodying, and celebrating emotions in TTRPGs is really the inspiration for this lecture. So a huge shout out to the other panelists on that panel, Jamie of Sword Queen Games, Kristen Devine of Dice Up Games, and Jay Dragon of Possum Creek Games. Jamie is currently making Apocalypse Keys with Evil Hat Productions and is also collaborating on a Kickstarter game you can check out. It should be in the description of this YouTube channel. Of this YouTube video. Our Haunt collaboration with Jay Dragon is on Kickstarter, and you can find Jamie's games. They have dozens of games on Sword Queen Games on itch. Kristen Devine is making Adorablins. Yes, Adorablins, which is an adorable pocket-sized storytelling game that you can get notified on launch on Kickstarter. So that should also be in the description of this video. Check it out. You can find Kristen at KristenIsNoJedi on Twitter. And finally, of course, last but not least, Jay Dragon is the designer behind Wanderhome, the RPG that's taking the TTRPG world by storm with Possum Creek Games. And Jay has so many fantastic insights. Just follow Jay on Twitter as well. Those links should be in the description. So with that out of the way, let's move into an introduction about the topic. I'm just going to poach the introduction from the Big Bad Con panel because it does a really good job setting the stage. So this is taken word for word from Big Bad Con's panel page, which is also linked below. In recent years, indie game designers, actual play streamers, and more gaming tables are incorporating and centering emotions that drive great games. Our panelists, this is me, will discuss how they, make games, run games, and play games that tap into emotions and where we're headed in the future. So, I guess a really basic question is, why should you care? Why are emotions in TTRPGs important to me, to other people in the community right now, and potentially to you? And what's the perspective I'm bringing to this conversation, right? Let's start with that question. So I'm an actual play GM. That's my perspective. I am most comfortable when GMing PBTA games, including Monster Hearts 2, Urban Shadows 2nd Edition, Masks, Monster of the Week. These are games that I've GM'd quite a lot, as well as, of course, Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition. But the way I do D&D 5e is super different, I think, from Rules as Written. And a lot of GMs who also do D&D kind of differently, I think, can really resonate with the perspective I bring. Because I am always story first, character first, right? As an actual play GM, it's crucial that there's a strong narrative, right? A strong plot. My players aren't just sort of dicking around and doing whatever, right? Because that's not really interesting or engaging for an audience. And that the plot is emotionally driven, because that's also what's going to hook an audience. If you're just sort of like going around killing stuff and doing quest by you can have a strong story that no one cares about. You know what I mean? People care about stories that make them feel things. This is true across all forms of media. I'm just gonna put it out there. I don't like to make generalizations or general statements, but that is what I feel pretty comfortable saying. People care about stories that make them feel things. This is true across film, across TV, across books. Even if the thing you feel is disgust, even if you don't like a book, there is such a thing as hate reading, my friends, and hate watching something. Why do you think Gossip Girl and frickin' Riverdale or whatever gets so many views and is so popular? It's because the story isn't good, but it makes you feel things, even if the thing is hatred. But hopefully that's not what my games make people feel, right? I want people to actually engage with my games and my tables, both in terms of the games I design and the games I run, in a way that feels emotionally resonant and emotionally rich. And I think especially now, I've been seeing a huge push, at least a more visible push, especially by marginalized creators, to create and play games that are about the characters and about the emotions they're going through, that center roleplay and center like the day-to-day stuff I feel, as opposed to how many monsters can we kill and how much loot can we grind. Right. And I think that's why it's important. If you're here, you're probably queer. If you're not, you will be, and that is a threat. Or at the very least, you're an ally, right? Which is also great. Because I tend to find that this is like queer folks are particularly drawn to emotionally driven games because, I mean, role-playing is so personal. Right? And we're going to get to that in a second when we talk about Bleed. But I hope I've made my case a little bit for why emotions are so important to me and so many people around us. It allows us to care about a table and about a game and about a campaign beyond just, all right, what's the monster of the week that we're fighting today? Right? It gives us, an opportunity to tune in to our table in a way that's really invested, right? The best stories I've heard about people gushing to me about their PCs or the D&D campaign they're in are all emotionally rooted. It's always like, oh my god, my GM threw this person from my backstory into this session and it completely blew me away. Or like, oh my god, I made this choice and now I'm a warlock and I made a pact with this eldritch entity. I'm so scared, right? It's all rooted in emotion. That's what makes people gush. That's what makes people talk about sessions they've had years down the line, right? That's what drives us to game, or me at least. So let's go into it. Let's talk about how do I center emotions as a GM. So I said this during the panel, and you should definitely watch the VOD of the panel. Some really great perspectives from those incredible panelists. I said this on a panel. I'm going to say it again. An idiom, a saying that really resonates with me is years down the line, someone won't remember what you said to them, or maybe even what you did to them, but they will sure as hell remember how you made them feel. And because of that, emotions are at the core of all prep I do, right? I'm constantly thinking about my players and their characters' emotional responses to the encounters I'm planning. But I'm not trying to force emotions, right? I'll never ask my character, I'll never tell my players how their characters feel, or I try not to. I might be like, your heart starts pounding, you start sweating as you enter this room and you're not quite sure why. And these are physical ways I'm trying to signal to my players that their characters should be feeling fear, right? Or I'll be like, oh, like a chill seeps into your bones and you feel like really small as this cavern yawns hugely all around you. And that should also signal that the space they're entering should be awe-inspiring. But I'll never say you feel angry because I said this, or like suddenly you're scared, unless it's a specific mechanic I'm playing with where you can mechanically be forced to feel fear, right? Like the frightened condition, for example, in D&D 5th edition, or charmed or whatever, right? So I'm never trying to force emotions. I see my job as the GM to set up situations and scenarios and scenes that are emotionally relevant to my PCs and just letting the players take the wheel from there, right? And a part of this is tapping into what my players and their characters care about, right? Because different players care about different things and different characters care about different things, right? Different hooks will compel them. So it's my job to design those hooks that they feel comfortable bouncing off of and expanding off of, right? So I'll give an example. In Transplanar, which is the Trans POC-led D&D 5th edition campaign, actual play campaign that I run that streams Saturdays at 3 p.m. US Central Time, in Transplanar, I have an elf sorcerer, Vinoc Scherzo, played by Erica Newgirl. Her whole thing, one of her things that she cares about a lot, as a player and as a character, is romantic love. Right? And a huge part of V's backstory is having her heart broken, shattered in this horrible way by someone she trusted and thought she knew, but he just betrayed her completely. He left her for dead, quite literally, right? And she was in love with him. So throughout the entire campaign so far, I have been trying to speak toward that emotional aspect by one of the first things I did was reintroduce her ex in the main campaign as an evil NPC, right? That she has literally fought like twice now. Burned his office down like twice, which was a lot of fun to play through and also prep. And those sessions, I could see my player come alive. She was like, oh my God, it's my ex. Everybody shut up. It's my ex. Right. And like, she was so excited to play through that. So another way I tried speaking toward this emotional aspect of V and her player, Erica, is by giving V a new love interest. One that felt organic and one that like V and Erica are both like smitten by and like genuinely in love with. Rev, everyone's favorite butch undead lesbian. And most recently, how I've, introduced a little bit of drama is to give V a second love interest who's now in direct confrontation with the other love interest I just given her. So that, that's fun for V. That's fun for Erica. Those are the emotional aspects she's interested in playing through, right? Romantic love. And exploring all the difficult things that come with having romantic love be important to you. Another example I'll give. My Aasimar Bloodhunter, also in Transplanar RPG, hello Oka fans, played by C, is all about, like, Oka's whole thing is about feeling like a monster. Right? Because they were exiled from their home for 7 years for sacrilege and treason that wasn't even really their fault. It's a tragedy, right? So this entire time up until episode 1, Oka's backstory is they've been wandering Andake, which you can see back here, for almost a decade, estranged from their family, whom they love so much. They love their family to death, just desperately trying to find a way to prove themselves so they can return in this like desperate hope at the very bottom of their heart that they're scared to nurse, right? Because they're scared they'll never be able to return home. But at the same time, they want to so bad. So it's been really important to me up until this point to throw encounters at my Bloodhunter at Oka that resonate with or challenge their worldview, how they see themselves and how the world sees them, right? So throwing NPCs at Oka that are mirrors of them. Hello, Kane, right? Other people who hate themselves and think of themselves as monstrous, right? Kane is one such character that we met in Arc 3, but interestingly enough, a love story developed there. Like, here are two characters, Oka and Kane, who hate themselves, right? But despite that, they learn to love each other through the hatred they hold for themselves. And by seeing that they can be loved, perhaps that's how they can start to love themselves. I am worthy of love. If someone as fucked up as you, if I can love someone as fucked up as you, and you can love someone as fucked up as me, then maybe there's hope, right? Maybe there's hope for both of us. So that was important to me. And also like designing encounters for Oka where they have to literally, for example, fight a mirror version of themselves that is everything they could have been if they hadn't been exiled. Oof. Right. Giving Oka also the opportunity to see two of their sisters whom they haven't seen in 7 years, but under terrible circumstances, also in Arc 3, because here Oka knows they can't go home with their sisters. This is just a chance meeting, right? Just a single one-off session. They can't go home. The time isn't right. They can't. No matter how much their youngest sister cries and begs and screams and wails, they can't go back. And that made for such an emotionally fraught and invested scene, right? I could see my player come to life in those encounters and in those instances. Another example, for also in Transplanar, my Aarakocra Artificer, Dewey Quirk, played by Max, is a bad dad, straight up horrible father. That's his thing, right? He's a coward, running away from his ex-employers who want to kill him. And in the process, it's not really his fault, but he probably could have done better. In the process, he abandons his wife and kid. So up until this point, in Arc 1, Max introduced Dewey as having this flying sword, right? That he has made as an artificer to fight for him and protect him because he's a coward. He's such a coward, he can't fight on his own. He can't even wield this sword by himself. He has to have his sword do his dirty work for him, right? So there was an opportunity about halfway through Arc 1 when a magical desk, this just happened organically, fell on top of Dewey's sword and shattered around it. Right? And I was like, I improvise. I was like, okay, this is an opportunity for me as a GM, right? I improvised a consequence, which is instead of breaking Dewey's sword, which I think other GMs might have done, which would have been interesting, but less interesting, I think, than what I decided to do, which is because the desk was magical, shattered on top of the sword, cracked the gem, and gave Dewey's sword sentience. Right? And the personality I gave that sword through the sentience was one of a child. So similar in age to Dewey's actual daughter, whom he abandoned. And I had the sword constantly refer to Dewey as dad, father, always asking questions, very much acting like a precocious child. And that was so freaking fun for me because I could see how uncomfortable and awkward Dewey as a character was feeling around having this sword. Like, he left his family, and now here's a reminder of that family, a reminder of the child he left behind, right? But it was such, an emotionally rich and interesting and fun, I hope, experience for Max as a player. Even though Max was like, I don't know what to do in this situation, but not in a bad way, right? Not in a way in which they felt, out of control of their own character's destiny, but in a way that they were excited to see where the story would go next. Right. So these are just some examples of how I like to center emotions in games and concrete ways, steps I've taken to do that. And I think some takeaways you might have from this, how can you apply this in your own home game, is to think about what your players care about in terms of their own character, right? And latch on to those as opportunities. I'm always cooking stuff up behind the scenes of Transplanar in Discord DMs in collaboration with my players about directions they could take their PCs in or scenes they want to play out. So an easy way for you to get started on this is to reach out to each of your players individually, right? And ask, hey, can you walk me through your PC's emotional landscape right now? I think that's a really good question to ask, and just sort of see what your players say. And I can guarantee you that their responses will be helpful and generative for session prep, right? And it'll be a start of a conversation that you can carry through with your players to see what they're interested in, right? Ask your players what their character's emotional landscape is right now, and maybe even ask them where you think it could go. And you can use that as knives to then stab in your players' backs later on. So what about on the player side, right? How do you center emotions as a player when you're role-playing? And I think, from my perspective, I think this will also be some valuable insight for GMs as well, thinking about the player experience, right? So I was really inspired specifically by what Kristen Devine said during the Big Bad Con 2021 panel, which, again, the VOD's up on YouTube. You should go watch it. I think it's up on Twitch, actually. Twitch.tv/BigBadCon. I was really inspired by Kristen. Because Kristen was talking about how when they first started playing TTRPGs, they just wanted to play this buff sword fighter who kicked ass, took names, and got loot, right? And I could resonate with that because when I first started playing TTRPGs, my first character ever that I played in someone else's game was a really, honestly, kind of shallow, really surface level character concept of like an extravagant bard, right? And I spent hours picking spells, like trying to optimize my character sheet, and maybe just like a couple of minutes fleshing out backstory. And I was like, I'll figure out the personality as I go. I'm an improviser. I'll figure it out, right? But mostly my goal as a player was to cause chaos, right? Do random stuff from session to session. I was like chaotic neutral to chaotic evil. I was such a problem player, not gonna lie. I was kind of a dick when I first started playing, right? Like, no shame in admitting that. No shame, no shame. Gabe, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. You're such a talented GM, and I'm sorry I put you through that. But as I started playing TTRPGs, like, more and more, and even through my first character, Johnslee, I was really hitting a stump, because I was like, who is Johnslee? Right? Like, who is this character? What drives her? Why is she going on an adventure when she could just sort of be, like, dicking around and not helping people? Right? Like, why her? Why now? And as I started, like, coming up with these questions, similar to Kristen, I started feeling like I wanted to go deeper. Right? I wanted to care more about my character, to have them go through an emotional experience, right? To have them change on a deep core level because of the campaign, because of the adventures they were embarking on, the NPCs they were meeting, the interactions they were having with the other PCs, right? As I started playing more and more TTRPGs, I realized that what I wanted out of this experience was to live through and play through my own, like, fantasy novel or my own fantasy TV show, and to have an emotional experience that was even richer than watching TV or reading a book, right? And I think a lot of other TTRPG players can resonate with that. There's something really special about playing in a TTRPG that allows us to tap into a universal desire, need at the core of so many of us, which is this human need to create, to imagine, to feel things, and to play, right? And I think that's actually a really good transition into the next part of my lecture, which is about facilitating emotions and bleed. So now I'm going to take a quick sip of water as always, and if at any point any of you watching this live have any questions, pop them in chat and I'll take them at the end of this lecture. Any follow-up questions about the theme of this lecture in general, or anything random, really. This is your chance to talk and for me to field. Okay. Yes, Risa, the sword sun was improvised. So moving into facilitating emotions and bleed. So how do I facilitate emotions as a GM, right? Like, how do I handle my players going through stuff, right? And I think that's a good transition into talking about bleed in general. I encourage you all to, again, watch the VOD. J-Dragon in particular gives a fantastic breakdown of what bleed is, and how Jay experiences bleed, and how Jay has seen other people experience bleed and talk about bleed as well. So my own recap of J-Dragon's words, right? These are not mine. These are J-Dragon's. It's just my recap. Is that right now there are basically two ways of thinking about bleed. Actually, before I get into this, I guess I should define bleed. Bleed is basically when you're playing a TTRPG or LARPing, right? I think that's where a lot of this terminology also comes from. LARPing, if you don't know, is live action role playing. Bleed is when you as a player start feeling stuff. Right? Like, you start, it gets kind of intense, and you're like, okay, this is getting kind of intense. I might need to step away. Or like, oh, wow, I'm actually crying. Like, I'm actually crying about something that my character's going through. It's when the veils between yourself as a person and this character you've created thin. Right? It's when those veils grow thin and you can really feel the thinning, I guess, is my way of putting bleed. So, my recap of J-Dragon's words. Right now, Jay says has observed that there are two ways of thinking about and talking about bleed. One way, which is more dominant, is that bleed is bad. And Jay, which is something I really loved how they talked about it, Jay specifically used the term a repressive model of thinking about bleed, right? This idea that feeling these really intense emotions that you're not sure if it's your character or you is a bad thing, something that needs to be controlled. manicured, right? Pruned, stopped. Something that we need to learn to curate or make smaller, right? How to come out of it, how to stop it from happening, how to leave it. Instead of the second way of thinking about bleed, which is to embrace it, right? To accept bleed as a potential way that role-playing can manifest in our bodies and in our spirits. To embrace bleed as a normal part of the TTRPG experience. Not something to be feared or hated or spurned or repressed or gotten rid of, but something to be acknowledged, honored, facilitated, talked through, given space to process, instead of just shut down or cut out, right? Or shoved to the side. And I guess I'll speak a little bit more personally. So I've experienced bleed before, more so on the player side, I think, than the GM side. Because I think as a player you have, okay, this is a generalization, but in the experiences I've had as a player, I find that I have less power in terms of like what happens in a campaign and like the kind of world I'm interacting with, right? Because that's usually on the GM side. So as a GM, this is also why I can run horror campaigns, I think in a way that feels more in control than I can play. Because it's one thing to like put the scary things in or put the hard things in, and one thing to just like experience it, right? And I think I don't want to get black and white with this. I don't want to do a strict dichotomy of GM as active and players as passive, because I don't think that's accurate, first of all, and I don't think it's a good model of thinking about GMing or playing. But I think that's why sometimes it can be, you know, for me, it's more common to experience bleed as a player than a GM. But anyway, I've experienced bleed before. I'm an Aries. So what that means is sometimes when I butt heads with people in character, I kind of get angry at them out of character. Like I'll be like, why are you disagreeing with my character? Like as Connie, I'll get like kind of frustrated. I'll feel that frustration bubbling up that isn't just my character, it's also me, right? But it's not just me, it's also my character. The lines are thin, right? And you know, I've also been in situations where after a session, I realize I'm really upset. Like a session will end and I'll like sit there and I'll be like, wow, I'm actually kind of upset, like as a person, about how another PC spoke to or spoke about my character, right? Or interacted with my character or acted around my character or did to my character, right? You know, and a lot of this I think happens because when I roleplay, I'm not just slapping some random numbers on a sheet and saying, this is my character, I don't really care what happens to them, right? I do care what happens to my character. I care deeply about what happens to my character because they're important to me. They're a part of me. The phrase that J-Dragon uses is, you know, our PCs are these little homunculi, right, of ourselves that we put parts of our souls into and put at a table and have them interact with other people's homunculi, right? And it's vulnerable, you know? A lot of ways it's kind of putting your heart on your sleeve. It's taking an emotional risk. You know, when you sit down at a table and you put this little homunculi in front of other people, you say, this is who I am. This is a part of me. What are you going to do to it? What do you think of me? Do you think I'm worthy? Do you think I'm fun? Do you think I'm interesting? Do you think I'm fun to play with? And that puts you in a vulnerable position. So when conflict occurs in campaign, of course bleed's going to happen, right? Like, duh, it's a no-brainer. J-Dragon said something really beautiful. Which is that all roleplay in TTRPGs is in some way autobiographical, right? And I just want to take that one step further. I believe that what J-Dragon said about it being autobiographical is true even if you try to resist it. Even if you specifically try to make it non-autobiographical, I don't think it's going to work. I just think it's impossible. Just sort of like how every piece of art you make, every single thing you write, the way you talk, right? The way you think about the way you think, right? The way you hold yourself, the way you sit, the things you choose to look at when you walk down a street. It's all autobiographical because it's you. It's coming from you. You're doing it. You're the one trying to resist it. It's still you, right? The way you resist an the way you try to resist an biography is autobiographical, right? So when we sit down to make a character and roleplay together and roll dice, that's autobiographical too. Duh, of course it is. We're telling stories about people who don't exist, which means we're inevitably telling stories about ourselves, right? And that's not a bad thing. It's scary, but it's not bad. It's not. It's just a part of how it works. It's just a part of how playing TTRPGs manifests for me. And instead of being scared of feeling these emotions when I play, even these emotions of anger and upsetness and a lot of times hurt, right? I've learned to celebrate this, right? I've learned to process my feelings in a way that feels not safe. I don't believe in safe spaces. I don't, just as a rule, but safer, right? For myself and for the people around me. So to use the getting angry example, when I feel anger rising inside me in character and out of character, because the lines are thin, I take a deep breath. And usually, if it's happening like in game, I'll intentionally step down from the scene in character, right? I'll have my character like acquiesce or like leave the scene or like change their point of view, right? Because I'm like, I don't want to pick a bone with you anymore. Like it won't be healthy for me as Connie if I keep picking this bone. So I will stop picking that bone like in character because I know myself, right? Know thyself. I know myself, and I'm like, if I keep arguing with you, like it's not gonna end well for either of us, my dude. Like it's not. So that's what I'll do. And usually, after the game ends, or maybe when the scene changes and I get a break from the campaign for a second, I'll message the player that I got angry with, right? And I'll just check in. I won't like message aggressively, be like, hey, I'm pissed off at you. I'll just be like, hey, that was a pretty like emotionally intense scene. How are you doing? How are you feeling? You want to talk about it? And open the door. Right? Not from a judgmental perspective, but from a perspective of wanting to understand each other, right? And I just think that's a better way of approaching conflict just in general, right? And I think this is when the kind of table you're playing at becomes really important. Because if you're playing at a table where people don't really give a shit about bleed, and people or rather, they don't really give a shit about processing bleed in a way that's healthier or safer, you're probably going to run into some problems, right? Because the norms you establish as a community of players and GMs are going to dictate how bleed is processed or not processed, right? And that's why decompression rituals, I think, are so important for the tables I run specifically. After every session, it's important for me to do checkouts, and how the checkouts look vary from table to table. My actual play checkouts are going to look different from my home game checkouts. Hi, Laura. But like no matter what, I always like to try to do stars and wishes. I try to like create avenues outside of when we're actually live and talking with each other where players can process stuff. Like for example, the Monster Hearts 2 game that I'm currently running for Laura, who's one of my who's my one and only champion patron, because I only have one slot. It's Laura. I made like diary channels in the Discord that we have where like anyone like you could just write like a journal entry and like process what happened during the session, right? And that's useful for me as a GM to read through to see what sorts of like emotions my players are latching onto, and to maybe be like, okay, we're getting a little too much of X here. I'm gonna try to pivot toward Y. And it's important to me in that game specifically to sort of like oscillate between like scary fantasy horror drama and like the mundanity of high school life. And it's good to have that balance, right? Because if it was like all fantasy horror all the time, that'd be kind of intense. Or like all high school drama all the time, that'd also be kind of intense, right? So knowing to like vary up the tone depending on where my players' mental states are at is also a skill that I'm still developing. It's also important to me that my players know that I am a resource and a sounding board, right? And an open ear for them to go to, right? I've had players come into my DMs expressing how upset they were, like because of bleed, or they were upset at me because of a ruling I made or something I did to their character that they felt like took agency away or like wasn't what they expected, or they felt like, oh, I really wanted this to happen, but that happened instead, right? And that's normal. That's fine. I don't think of that as a mark of bad GMing. I think of that as a opportunity for growth and an opportunity for the campaign to become even more of what the player wants, right? And I feel really honored when players come to me with feedback, right? Or with like notes or desires for the future, because that means I know they feel comfortable talking to me, right? They feel like they can come to me to discuss these things, because if they didn't, then that's bad, right? If they feel like they can't talk to me, then I take that as a mark of failure instead of like players coming to me with feedback, right? And it's important to me that I don't shut down those conversations, right? I encourage and I open those conversations, and I try to help my players process their feelings, first of all, and then find a way forward in the fiction together, right? Because I truly believe that when we as a society embrace bleed, we're also embracing the difficult, thorny, complicated parts of bleed. We can't just say, bleed's great, and then like not support each other or hold each other when hurt inevitably happens, right? I think that if we're trying to forge a way forward as a community of TTRPG gamers, where we embrace bleed, then we also need to embrace hard conversations, right? Because they're gonna happen, and not shut those down either. Getting hurt, right? Getting upset, feeling hurt, let's say, is a normal part of life. It just happens. It's a part of the human experience. I truly believe that. We are gonna, in our lives, we're gonna hurt other people and we're gonna get hurt by other people. That's just how it works, right? That's normal. And I think knowing how to manage that hurt, knowing how to talk about it, how to process it is crucial in being in community with each other, right? In a broader sense, I'm coming from a queer perspective because that's who I am, right? I cannot count the number of times I have seen in my life queer people and just people hurt each other, and then just the situation just spirals out of control because they don't know how to talk about it, right? They don't know how to handle it. None of the parties involved or any of their friends or witnesses or bystanders know what to do, right? Usually it's a situation of, oh, you hurt me, which means you're a bad person. You're a terrible person. And anyone who associates with you is also a terrible person, right? Oh, your character was mean to me, which means you as a player, you're a mean or a bad person. Oh, your character got drunk and hit or offended this nice bartender that our party was talking to, and now I'm mad at you because the bartender won't give us our next quest, and it's your fault and you ruined my fun. See what I mean? Right? I really don't like that model. I do not like that way of looking at, dealing with, and talking about hurt and bleed at all. I think it's really Puritan. I think it's really absolutist. I think it's a really morally constipated way of looking at the world and talking about each other and ourselves. And I really think that in terms of TTRPGs, the sooner we embrace the fact that bleed's gonna happen and that it's normal and that it's fine, like it's okay, the sooner we can start having conversations about how to help each other process it, right? Restorative justice, baby. Anyway, I don't know what else to say. Yeah, I'm gonna take a quick break to drink some water and look at the chat before I move on to the next topic, which is how I facilitate emotions in my game design. Oh god, excuse me, one sec. Water down the wrong pipe. Okay. So while we're still on the topic of bleed, Laura in... Ooh. Okay, I just thought I crapped out for a second, but I didn't. Laura in chat says, I learned the term bleed when I'd been LARPing a decade, and it was life-changing. Yeah, I really wish I had these concepts when I first started role-playing, when I first started doing TTRPG specifically. I think it would have helped me a lot as a role player. And just as like a person, you know what I mean? In my LARP communities, we talk about both good bleed and bad bleed. So I avoid some instances and embrace some, and I see no conflict between them. Bleed has helped me form amazing relationships, and one time it made me feel like I was going to die in an intense combat LARP. Excuse me, I knew I wouldn't, but I needed to break play briefly. Yeah, it can get intense. I think I really like what you said, Laura, about like good bleed and bad bleed, but not seeing like a conflict between them. Because I hesitate, I think, to prescribe, I think, values onto kinds of bleed, right? Saying these are the only kinds of bleed that happen, and there's no crossover, and they're in their own separate categories, right? I think I disagree with the approach that there is good bleed, there's bad bleed, and that's it, right? I think there's opportunity for bleed to be good, where you're like, oh my god, this is good. It's good that I'm going through these emotions. I'm having an emotionally rich experience, right? And that can easily cross over into bad bleed, right? Like, okay, it's rich, but oh god, okay, so no, like, it's not fun anymore. It's not fun anymore for me, right? That can also happen, right? And I think there's opportunity for bad bleed to teach us things, right? About ourselves, right? Oh shit, I feel really upset. I'm sobbing. I'm dissociating. I need to step away. But then that teaches you about, okay, I've discovered a new line for myself, right? And that's something good you can take out of the quote unquote bad bleed, right? Yeah, I guess I just don't want to assign moral or value judgments to emotions. You know what I mean? Like, jealousy isn't bad. It's not bad to feel jealous, right? Anger isn't bad. It's not bad to feel angry. And I think once we start thinking about emotions as good or bad, we get into a really thorny place that I don't want to get to, if that makes sense. But I'm not like necessarily disagreeing with you either, I think, Laura. But yeah, okay. Again, if you have any questions, follow-up things, put them in chat and I'll grab them. Now let's talk about facilitating emotions in game design. So how do I do that? And I'm going to use, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use my upcoming game, which is going to come out before the end of 2021. I'm going to finish the core rules by then. I'm putting it out there. I am manifesting, right? My upcoming game, God Killer RPG, I'm going to use that as a lens. So if you're new here, what the hell is God Killer RPG? Well, I'll pitch it to you. I'll let you know. God Killer RPG is a holy punk powered by the apocalypse game for one player, the God Killer, and one GM, God. On the surface, God Killer RPG is about exploring a post-apocalyptic, divinely irradiated wasteland of a dystopia, where you as the God Killer, you kill gods and you make a name for yourself, right? But the deeper emotional core of this game is about the player being torn between their mortal heart and their divine powers. You play the only mortal in the entire realm capable of killing a god, which puts you as a player, as a character, in a really interesting and unique position right off the bat, right? The premise of why is the PC important is baked into, the answer to why is the PC important is baked into the premise of the game itself, which is something I'm proud of myself for doing. And the central theme, right, throughout this game that I'm really interested in exploring through rules and mechanics and setting and flavor text is that power doesn't corrupt, it reveals, right? So what kind of a world are you as a god killer gonna make, right? What gods are you gonna kill? What gods are you gonna spare, right? How are you gonna transform this world around you with violence? And, as a result, how are you going to transform yourself? And how is other people's violence going to change you as well, right? So that's the emotional core of God Killer, right? It's about discovering who you are through inflicting violence, having violence inflicted upon you, and of course, having fun committing sacrilege, right? And it's important to me to reinforce those themes through the mechanics. So let's talk about how I attempt to do that. First things first. This game, God Killer, embraces being suboptimal in quotes. What I mean by suboptimal is standing in juxtaposition with power gaming in trad games like Pathfinder or like D&D, right? When you have an optimal character, that means your character is really good at what the game wants your character to be good at, which is killing stuff. Right? Almost like a video game character. What's my best loadout? What's the best gear? What points am I going to put in what stats? Right? And like, what are the ways my character sheet can like synergize with each other? I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. That's just one way of playing the game. And I really like playing super and like making really OP characters. That's something I get a lot of joy out of as a player when I do D&D stuff. Right? But that's not really what I'm concerned with when designing God Killer. Right? And that's part of like the core design philosophy behind this game. It's embracing being suboptimal, right? You as the God Killer, you're fucked up. There's no way to not be fucked up as the God Killer. Just simply no way. If you try to design a character that's not fucked up, you are rejecting the premise of the game, right? And you should play a different game, straight up. The God Killer is a messy person with a messy heart. This is not a game about playing it safe. This is a game about taking risks and making big choices, right? Always making the bigger choice. And I try to reward that mechanically in the game text instead of punish it, which I think D&D does. I think D&D punishes players who are suboptimal, because if your player has a bad to hit, bonus, or is always rolling with disadvantage because you're playing a blinded character all the time and you're using the blinded rules in rules as written. There's an interesting parable about ableism in there somewhere, I think. Then you're suboptimal. You're always rolling with disadvantage. You're not going to hit. And it's not fun to not hit in D&D, right? And other players at the table might get angry at you or frustrated that you're not engaging with the rules in that way, right? So it's important to me that Godkiller doesn't punish, but instead rewards mechanically for engaging with the premise of the Godkiller being a fucked up person, right? So what does it mean to reward that, right? If I can hear the questions already, Connie, but if the game's all about being suboptimal, are you going to reward people by being suboptimal by making them more optimal? No, that's not how it works. Let's talk about mechanics for this game. I'm using PBTA engine sort of mashed with BOB, so belonging outside belonging, token economy a little bit. So the core play loop is like this. On the player side, as the Godkiller, there are just give me a second, 3 types of moves you can make. There are mortal moves, which every time you make a mortal move, you get 2 tokens, and you spend those tokens on the next type of moves you can make, which are Godkiller moves. And Godkiller moves might be more recognizable to those who have played a lot of PBTA games. These are essentially basic moves, right? In Masks, the basic moves are directly engage a threat, pierce the mask, it's been so long, take a powerful blow, right? These are just like regular moves that, you know, any players at the table might be able to engage with at any time, right? You spend tokens on these moves. In Godkiller, and this is a mechanic I've poached from Apocalypse Keys by Jammy. Check it out, buy it. Evil Hat Productions, it's an incredible game so far, where there are 2 kinds of misses. So if you're new to PBTA, a hit, when you roll dice in PBTA to find out what happens next, there are 2 end states. You either hit, which means you do it. Typically in PBTA games, this is meaning you get a 7 or up on the dice, and it's a 2d6 economy, which basically just means you roll 2 6-sided dice, right? And you add whatever modifiers your character sheet might give you, whether it's a negative modifier or a positive one. A hit is generally a 7+, right? And that's usually a mixed success. A 7 to 9 in most PBTA games is a mixed success, which means you get what you set out for, but there might be some complications, right? Or you might have to give like one thing up, or you might not do it fully in the way you wanted to, but it is still a hit. You still do it, right? A full hit is a 10+ in most PBTA games, which means you do it. No strings attached. That's usually what it means, and you might even find something extra. A miss is a 6 or below, and that usually means the GM tells you what happens next. There might be unforeseen complications, or the basic move might tell you something specific that happens on a miss, depending on the specific basic move you're engaging with, right? That's like how I think Monster of the Week does it. That's how Apocalypse World does it. That's how Masks does it. That's how Avatar Legends does it, etc. Apocalypse Keys does it differently. Apocalypse Keys is also a token-based kind of PBTA, kind of BOB game. There are 2 kinds of misses. There are strong misses, right? And I guess weak misses. So weak misses are the classic 6 and below. You don't do enough, right? The GM tells you what happens. It's not quite there. But a strong miss is, I think actually a weak miss is 7 under, and a strong miss is 11+ in Apocalypse Keys, which means you go too far, you do too much, you overplay your hand, you reveal too much, etc., which is interesting. Because specifically, in Apocalypse Keys, you're playing these super overpowered, like really, like you're basically playing like Hellboy, right? You're trying to like, you're playing these monster like characters that are trying to hold back the apocalypse, but you're also monsters. So you might end up bringing the apocalypse that you were trying to prevent in the first place, right? So if you get a strong miss, that's a sign that you went too far. Like you wrecked the place when you were trying to like bring down the baddie, right? Or like the magic spirals out of control instead of being able to funnel and be controlled, right? And a hit in that case is rarer. It's harder to get a hit than it is in most PBTA games. And because it's a token economy, instead of having stats in Apocalypse Keys, which is also true for Godkiller, you spend tokens on Godkiller moves. So instead of having like, oh, my cool is a +2, so when I roll this move, I add a +2 if it's using the cool stat, you always decide if you want to spend tokens on a move and how many tokens you want to spend, right? So that's how mortal moves and God Killer synergizes with God Killer moves, and how they speak toward emotion, right? And the third kind of move you can have that I've designed are called Crucible Moves. These are the equivalent of special or peripheral moves in a lot of PBTA games. And Crucible Moves in God Killer are basically cover rare and important situations where you as a character decide what kind of person you're going to be. And this speaks toward the transformative emotional aspect of the game. Right? This game is all about finding out who you are, and this kind of move helps mechanize that, right? So examples of a Crucible move, I took this one from Masks, but I sort of reflavored it, repoached it, re-skinned it really, kind of from the bones up, to fit the rest of the mechanics, is accept or reject someone's influence, pass out or power through. The God Killer can always choose if you like are full up on your harm track, which I'll get to in a second, you can choose to pass out, or if you want to try to power through, right? There's consequences for both. Kill or spare a god is the other important Crucible move. And you'll notice the Crucible moves are always a choice. It's always a choice between this or that. And that is on purpose. And each choice has a different like series of rules you need to follow depending on the choice you make, right? That was on purpose. I wanted each kind of move, mortal, God Killer, and Crucible, to feel really different, not just in flavor, but in how the mechanics work. Which brings me to mortal moves, actually, which is the basic building block of God Killer. Mortal moves are basically, they represent the God Killer's connection with their mortal heart, right? What makes them fallible, loving, fierce, human, right? They're messy and transformative, just like the God Killer, and they sort of stand in opposition to God Killer moves, which are sort of like stronger moves they can take, right? That like drive the story forward even more, and speak toward the power they have as a God Killer, right? So God Killer moves are similar to basic moves. There's stuff like Go Loud, which is my direct engage a threat move, Sway, Pray for Guidance, Use Magic, which is Channel the River, in God Killer because of the setting. But mortal moves are stuff like, so I'm actually really excited about how I've designed it so far. At character creation, you mark, I think I said 3. Yeah, at character creation, you mark 3 mortal moves that you have access to. And there's a whole ass list. I think in total I have designed, let me just very quickly check. I have designed like 27 different mortal moves that you can mark, right? And at character creation, you can mark 3. And you can swap out the moves you mark based on engaging with other aspects of God Killer's mechanics. So I'm just gonna like pick randomly. A mortal move could be flaunt your power, indulge a vice, make a promise, pet an animal, break something fragile, hide, threaten someone with force, monologue, right? These are all mortal moves, and you get tokens for doing any of these in a given session, right? And there's like more to each of these. It's not just, I give, there's more guidance for how the moves play out. But it was important to me that mortal moves reflected stuff that just people do, and also that specifically that players do in sessions. All of these mortal moves, from my design perspective, I wanted them to be engageable on like a session to session level. How I came up with them was like, okay, what do I see my players doing? Across all the games I've ever GM'd, what do I see my players doing, and why do they do those things? I see my players lie all the time. I see my players do shitty things, indulge a vice, right? I see my players sort of like put on airs, flaunt their power. I see my players sort of like jump into things without acting, or, I don't know, let's put together a plan, guys. Think before they act, or act before they think. These are both mortal moves you can make, right? That was important to me. That mortal moves feel resonant both for your God Killer and for you as a player, right? What's your play style? Do you like to think before you act? Then you should probably mark that as a move during character creation, right? And don't worry too much if you find out that your play style evolves, because that's the point of mortal moves. You can swap them out. You can unmark one and mark another by engaging with the mechanics later on, right? So don't be scared, if you're like, oh shit, I'm lying a lot, but I don't have that marked. You can always unmark one move and mark lie again, and there are ways that synergizes with the rest of the rule set, right? So that's how I'm sort of like bringing emotions to the forefront with mortal moves. And of course, you spend the tokens that you gain from making mortal moves on God Killer moves, right? Where that have 2 fail states, weak misses and strong misses, right? And then you really want to be in that sweet spot of, of an 8 to 10. 8 to 10 is the sweet spot. 7 below is weak miss. 11 to plus is strong miss. I don't so much care about math. I just sort of look at a number range and I go, yep, that sounds good. But I'm sure Jammy has thought about math a lot, and I think it shakes out to be about like 30%, like a third of the time you're gonna be like getting like full hits, but like 60, like the other 2/3 of the time you're gonna be missing in one way or another, which feels accurate, I think, in terms of like how I would want a session to go, I think. The Crucible Moves, the next thing I really want to talk about before I think wrapping up this lecture are conditions in my game. This is another way I mechanize emotions in a really obvious way. But also, I'm doing something with conditions that I haven't really seen other PBTA games do, and I'm excited to see how they playtest. So, conditions, if you're not aware, are a thing that I think Masks introduced, at least into like the mainstream. Instead of having like hit points or like a harm tracker like in Monster of the Week or Monster Hearts, or HP in like Pathfinder or D&D or whatever, Masks uses conditions because harm isn't important. These teenage superheroes in Masks are gonna get beat up, but that's not what we're focused on narratively. We're focused on their emotional state, and there are five conditions that are universal through all Masks playbooks and all NPCs as well, which I disagree with, but we're gonna get into that in a second. The Masks conditions you can mark as a player are angry, insecure, afraid, hopeless. Oh my god, if you can name it before me, I will give you a brownie point. Angry, insecure, hopeless, afraid, and what is the other one? There's one more. Guilty? No. Oh my god. Anyway, there are 5. I promise there are 5. And I've liked it. When I first started GMing Masks, I was like, oh, this is such an inventive way of tracking the stuff your character goes through that's not HP, right? Or harm. That's such an inventive way of looking at it, because it's conveying that the emotions are important, not the physical journey, right? The internal journey. And I really liked it. But the more I started GMing Masks and playing Masks, the more I was like, ooh, I wish conditions could do this, right? I wish we could do that with conditions. I wish we could bring this in or take this out. And this is how conditions in Godkiller currently works. You start the game with 5 condition slots. And similar to Monster Hearts 2, when the GM or move tells you to mark a condition, then you can write in your own, or you can pick from a list of like basic conditions. And I've come up with 13, right? And the basic conditions that you can always pick from include humiliated, obsessed, reckless, compliant, foolish, right? Which I honestly just think are better conditions than like angry or insecure, right? Which sometimes doesn't really make sense to mark in a game. What I really enjoyed about Monster Hearts 2's condition mechanic is the ability for players to write in their own and have some agency in deciding like what the condition they're gonna mark is. But something I did not / do not enjoy about how Monster Hearts 2 does conditions is sometimes it's too open-ended. Sometimes I'm like, oh god, what should you mark? I don't know. And my player's like, and I'm like, and we just sort of go back and forth like, until we do pissed off, I guess, when we write that down, right? So I wanted to give a little bit more structure, which is why it's important to me to have a list that players and GMs can choose from. They can always resort to if you're not sure what to pick, right? It's also important to me in the text of the rules that a condition, to help guide the kinds of things you think of, a condition can be anything as long as it's negative or intense or both, right? So obsessed isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is intense, right? And it's also important to me that the GM never tells the player what condition to mark. The player always decides. That's also something I didn't really like about Masks. In Masks rules as written, the GM could be like, mark hopeless, and you just have to do it. Which I don't really like. I think on either end of the transaction, I always like to give my players the ability to decide. It just feels more fair and more fun that way, I think. Yeah. So another way that I'm fiddling with how Masks and Monster Hearts 2, and Thirsty Sword Lesbians, I suppose, does conditions, is is the mechanic to use conditions. So conditions are mostly there mechanically to guide how you play your character, right? And when you're at 5 and need to mark another, you have to take the Crucible move, pass out, or power through. But I don't want to get into the fiddly mechanics yet. I'm just gonna give you a little taste of it. They're mostly there to guide how you play your character. If you look at your sheet and you're like, fuck, I have 4 conditions marked, you're probably kind of unhinged, right? And you can play your character as kind of unhinged, kind of on the brink of losing it, right? But conditions can also help you out mechanically or tangibly, right? Something I do not like about masks. I am planting my sword in the sand here. Something I staunchly dislike about how masks does conditions is how they impose a -2 penalty on certain rolls, certain moves. I guess it makes sense. Yeah. It means you'll miss more often on those moves. But it also kind of sucks because when you start marking more conditions, you could do a negative snowball really easily. You could just snowball into marking more conditions because you miss, and you miss because you mark more conditions, so you mark more conditions and make you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just a negative ass feedback loop that I didn't really like engaging with all the time as a GM, right? I also did not like how masks dealt with removing conditions, because the only way to remove a condition was either to do a basic move, comfort or support, and to hit on it, right? So if you have a -2 to that move and you're trying to like get rid of your condition by comforting or supporting, fucking you're shit out of luck, right? Or to do something according to the condition. So I think for angry, it's to lash out or break something. For hopeless, or for afraid, it's to run from something difficult. And then like once you run from something difficult, you can unmark afraid, right? Which also didn't really make sense to me. I have GM'd dozens of mask sessions at this point, and the number of times I've seen players remove conditions by engaging with that part of the mechanics, I can count on 3 fingers. 3. Through dozens of sessions. Dozens. And I think it's because it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to remove an angry condition by smashing something, right? Because probably you smashed something to get the angry condition, so why would you smash something again? Probably after marking angry, you want to chill out or your friends want to talk you down, right? And comfort or support, but if they miss on that, you're shit out of luck, right? Or like something I've seen how masks GMs get around it is they'll just be like, enough time has passed, you can unmark it. Or, oh, that was a good conversation, role play, I'm not going to have you roll comfort or support, you can just remove a condition of your choice, right? And I want that to be reflected in the text of Godkiller, like somehow, right? So conditions do not inflict, first of all, conditions do not inflict a negative penalty on your rolls, ever. They're just there, right? They're just there to look at you and for you to look at. Secondly, whenever you make a basic or crucible move, you can choose to use a condition. If you do, name the condition you're using and you apply a +2 or a -2 to the move, your choice. Which means this can potentially change a weak or strong miss into a hit. Every time. If you have at least one condition marked, you've got a free +2 or -2 floating around, which is super valuable. If you're like, I really don't want this move to miss. Oh God, it's 2 over. Oh shit. I've got humiliated marked. I'll use that. Right? But in order to use a condition on a move, it has to make sense in the narrative, and you have to role play it in a way that conveys the condition, my friend, which I think mechanically incentivizes players to engage emotionally, right? So an example that I've written here is, let's say a Godkiller wants to share the load, which is a basic move, basic comfort or support, with an NPC that they're in love with, right? So the player spends 2 divinity tokens, they descend to spend 2, but they end up rolling a 9 on the dice, which means they get an 11, which is a strong miss. And shit, the player really doesn't want the consequences of that strong miss. So they're like, you know what? I'm going to use my timid condition to bring that 11 down to a 9, which is a full hit. And so the player describes their Godkiller timidly shuffling toward their love interest on like this crumbled ancient balcony, and the Godkiller, role plays out trying to comfort this NPC, but they stumble over their words the entire time. They're always second guessing the advice they give. They put their foot in their mouth. And based on how the player's role playing their character, the GM decides, you know what? The 9 holds. You're being pretty timid. I will allow it. And the game continues, and they get to take the mechanical boons of rolling a full hit on Share the Load. Right, so that's an aspect of doing conditions in a way that I haven't really seen other PBTA games do, that I'm really excited about, that I think puts emotions first and incentivizes players to think emotionally instead of thinking with their sheet. Don't think with your sheet, think with your heart, right?
And yeah, I suppose that's the thing I want to end on for everything on my end. I hope this has been, useful or helpful for y'all, just to sort of recap everything before moving into the audience Q&A section. I think emotions are important. I think they're great. I want more of them, yes, and I'm so happy about these new waves of games, specifically by queer marginalized designers, and I think that's for a reason, you know what I mean? Putting emotions first in our games, and both in the games we design and the games we run and play in. And I really think that's the future. I think that's the future of TTRPGs. It's as the hobby grows, as more people are attracted to this hobby, as more marginalized creators gain more of a platform and visibility, I think we're really going to see games where roleplay is really prized, and narrative comes first, and story comes first, and character comes first, and the hearts come first, instead of more old school ways of doing games. Not that there isn't value in both types of games, and I would really love to play or design or GM for a game that blends both, right? That is both crunchy and emotional. I think that would honestly be the true future of games that I'm really looking forward to. I hope this was useful. I'm now going to turn toward the Q&A section of this lecture. Let's take a look here. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Risa. Risa says that's such an interesting concept. You can kill gods with the power of having petted many animals. Yes, I guess technically, yeah. When you put it like that, yes. But I also think that's beautiful that can happen, because the theme of Godkiller, of power doesn't corrupt, it reveals, is so important to me. Like, if the kind of Godkiller you want to play is a really gentle Godkiller who pets animals, and thinks before they act, and maybe flinches or hesitates or stalls all the time, is still able to kill a god, right? Is still able to make a future that they believe in, as much as a Godkiller who goes around lying, fucking and trucking around the cradle, which is the name of the setting, the canon setting for Godkiller, can, right? That's important to me, that all kinds of Godkillers, all ways of engaging with the game, are respected and honored in the text. So yeah, I don't see any other questions here. So I think I'm just gonna do a quick outroduction. Thank you to everyone so much for tuning in to Professor Chang's Tabletop Workshop Lecture 12, Facilitating Emotions. I've been your GM and your lecturer, Connie, Professor Chang. My pronouns are they, he, and she. You can find me on Twitter, Itch, and Patreon at by Connie Chang. A huge shout out to my apprentices and above patrons here in chat today. Thank you so much for pledging, for supporting my Patreon. I know I haven't been super active recently. I've only really hopped on for Professor Chang's and Patreon Gaming Night. So I've been very appreciative of your support through that. I'm excited to actually start posting more GM advice articles up on my Patreon, and more behind the scenes content, specifically as Godkiller starts getting off the ground. I'd love to just post more works in progress that y'all can look at, so you can sort of consult my mechanics in addition to the lecture that I'm putting on. Either way, I really appreciate it. If you haven't pledged to my Patreon already, there's a link below in the description. Please consider tossing a coin to your Connie if you got anything out of this lecture. Announcements as of the recording of the session. Transplanar RPG is the actual play stream and podcast that I GM and produce for. We're an all-transgender, POC-led, 100% homebrew Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition live-streamed actual play campaign set in an original, non-colonial, anti-Orientalist world, streaming Saturdays at 3 p.m. U.S. Central Time, and for now, Tuesdays at 7 p.m. U.S. Central Time, with our mini-series Hounds of Mercy versus Mercy 7 Evil X's and all of Endake, which is a all-trans, all-BIMPOC miniseries that is volume 1 of Endake anthologies, which are parallel campaigns, right, in addition to our main campaign. So tune in to Transplanar RPG Saturdays and Tuesdays, and thank you all so much for watching this lecture. I really appreciate all of you. If you're tuning in today live, come to Patreon Gaming Night. I'm going to put together a Kahoot tournament. I'm going to come up with some prizes, hopefully. Fingers crossed. We'll see what the prizes will be. And come join the Kahoot tournament, where we will do trivia about TTRPGs and about just general knowledge stuff. In the past, I've done questions about the classics and Latin, critical race theory, as well as Chinese history, right? And like American history as well, and art and film, right? So tune in, it'll be fun. Also Connie trivia questions as well. Like, fun facts about Connie that I bet you didn't know. So yeah, love y'all so much. Thank you for tuning in and have a great rest of your day. Bye.